Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We will get started in just a moment. Going to give just another minute to allow other people to join the meeting. So we'll go ahead and get started here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. My name is Max Odland. I'm an environmental scientist with the Fire and Resource Assessment Program here at CAL FIRE. And I'm very excited to welcome you today for our presentation from Dr. Derek Young from UC Davis, who is one of our grantees in our Forest Health Research Program. And his presentation today is improving predictions of post-fire forest regeneration by mapping individual surviving trees. Before we get started, I do have a little bit of housekeeping. First up, this meeting is being recorded, and the presentation portion of it will be posted to our website that's listed there for webinars and events. I will share that link in the chat as well so that folks know where to access it. And we will be having a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So at any point, feel free to type any questions you have into the chat, and we will do our best to get them answered during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. You also, I believe, can raise your hand, although Teams has changed some of its settings since we started doing this. So if that's not an option, you can go ahead and enter your question into the chat, and we will make sure to get to it as well. Today's presentation is part of our Forest Health Research Program, and that is a program that's partially funded by California Climate Investments. The program has many goals, but some of its main aims are to prioritize and fund research in forest health and fire science that's critical to the state of California, share scientific information, and to support statewide plans, including the California Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan. And as of today, the solicitation for our forest health research grants are still open. We are accepting concept proposals until tomorrow. So if anyone on here is planning to submit a concept proposal, please do so by 3 p.m. tomorrow. Without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce our speaker. Sorry, I need to get back to the meeting here. Just 1 second. Okay, sorry about the technical difficulties there. I would be very happy to introduce our speaker, Derek Young. Derek is a research ecologist and data scientist at UC Davis and director of the Open Forest Observatory. His research is largely focused on understanding forest recovery from large-scale disturbances like drought and wildfire. Underlying all of Derek's work is the aim to use ecological data to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of forest management in a changing world. Thank you very much for being here, Derek. Please take it away.
Awesome, thanks, Max. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming. It's great to have this venue to share some of our recent work. So I'm going to talk about tackling this problem of predicting post-fire forest recovery, specifically by combining some field ecology and new technology and data tools, especially around drones. So why post-fire recovery? Well, as we all know well, we've been experiencing a dramatic increase in fire activity, and including increase in the area burned at high severity by about an order of magnitude over the last 30 years, actually. And the increase in high severity area also generally comes along with an increase in the size of these contiguous high severity patches. And most of the tree species in these dry western conifer forests are not adapted to large high severity patches. They don't have a soil seed bank, so tree regeneration generally depends on seeds dispersing in from nearby surviving trees. And seeds are generally large and dispersed by wind relatively short distances. So when there are no surviving trees nearby, seed rain can essentially approach zero. And when initial conifer regeneration is poor, competing vegetation like shrubs and grasses can become established and result in a vegetation type conversion that can last for decades. This is a photo from, I think it's the 1989 Lehman fire on the Plumas National Forest that was taken about 30 years post-fire. You could see it used to be forested and it's still almost completely shrub dominated. And so when in situations where natural forest recovery is poor, forest managers can intervene to plant tree seedlings and speed forest recovery. But with limited resources, they need to know where to focus their efforts, and in particular, where do we expect natural recovery to be weak. And so this need has led to a lot of great work to explain and predict post-fire forest recovery, especially natural tree seedling establishment post-fire. And one consistent and intuitive result is this relationship between recruiting seedling density, shown on the y-axis in all these figures, and the distance to the nearest surviving tree on the x-axis. Really clear and common pattern and predictor of post-fire recovery. But just simply the distance to the nearest tree leaves out a lot of important seed dispersal dynamics. For example, we may have one plot that's 50 meters from a single surviving tree, like the one on the left here, and another that's 50 meters from dozens of trees on all sides, like the one on the right. And they're both 50 meters from the nearest seed source, but we'd expect a huge difference in the seed rain at each of them. And some recent work has begun to acknowledge this nuance. Like Alan Tepley quantified seed availability as the percent of live forest cover within a 400-meter radius of each plot using aerial imagery. Peeler and Smithwick did the same thing, and but explored a range of radii and found that 50 to 100 meters did best. And Kristen Shive developed this approach that uses an existing wall-to-wall map of live basal area and applied a Gaussian smooth to basically smear that basal area spatially a little bit beyond where the trees actually are, and ultimately produce a seed availability proxy. And this approach is used at the core of a really important and widely used post-fire planning tool in California called Postscript, the post-fire conifer regeneration prediction tool. So it was developed by Kristen and then expanded by a group of us led by Joe Stewart and Phil Van Matgum and Micah Wright, and into a web interface where you can upload a fire severity map of a new fire, and it'll predict the predicted probability of seedling regeneration across that landscape using models fitted to extensive plot data set, mostly collected by Kevin Welch. And like I mentioned, so this model includes a dispersal component, and the way it models dispersal is by taking this map of live tree basal area and applying this smooth to turn it into a seed availability proxy. And this is a creative solution to the problem of needing to know where are the surviving trees, the seed sources, across an entire fire, something that's not feasible to do on the ground. And so we can instead rely on existing forest structure maps. But they also have limitations. They're not super accurate always, but they're the best we have in many situations. But when we do have the luxury of knowing where all the surviving trees are, then at least in theory, we can really improve on this by accounting for the fact that seed input in any given spot is actually it's the sum of each individual tree's seed contribution or seed shadow that was shown in this foundational paper by Jim Clark. So if we can fit the seed shadow, or more technically known as the dispersal kernel for a species, and map all of those reproductive trees across the landscape, then we can predict regeneration by summing all of their individual seed shadows. So we can apply this concept to these heterogeneous post-fire landscapes to more explicitly account for the spatial arrangement of the seed sources. Part of why we haven't approached it this way is we haven't had reliable individual tree maps post-fire, but LiDAR and other technology is rapidly changing that. So we set out to identify some of the best ways to bring in individual tree data. So this leads me to the ultimate objective of this work I'm presenting today is to predict post-fire seedling density across space based on the locations and sizes of individual surviving trees. And so the approach we take here involves mapping the surviving trees and specifically using low-cost drone-based technology that I'll get into, and then quantifying seedling abundance in a dense grid of plots across space. And that's an example of that is shown in the figure here, the colored points. And then fit a dispersal kernel based on the summed contribution of each tree of seeds from each tree to each seedling plot. So I'll walk you through our approach to this in 3 parts, starting with our approach to drone-based forest mapping at the individual tree level, and then applying the individual tree data to this ecological question of seed dispersal modeling and predicting post-fire regen. And then I'll wrap up by talking about some of our ongoing and forthcoming forest mapping work. So starting with our approach to drone-based forest mapping. And I want to kind of preface this and emphasize that this is all using low-cost consumer-grade drones with just a simple camera. There's other options out there, but we want this to be something that's as accessible as possible to other scientists and practitioners and the general public. So we're focusing on really low cost and accessible equipment. And so why use drone imagery for this task, especially when we have increasingly available high resolution satellite and aerial imagery like this USDA NAPE aerial imagery. It's an amazing resource. It's wall to wall across most of the US. It's 60 centimeter resolution collected every 2 years. Super valuable data set. In comparison, drone imagery is much higher resolution, less likely to miss trees that can hide in the shadows in the NAPE imagery. You can collect it almost any time, for example, even right after a wildfire, at least once the airspace is authorized again. And but regardless of the data set, pinpointing the locations of individual trees is not a trivial task. If you want to turn either of these into a digital map of trees, how would you confirm that, for example, this tree is different than this one in a robust and automated way? That's our big challenge. And so for this purpose, drone imagery has one additional really valuable facet, is it can provide detailed 3D structured data, even with low-cost consumer-grade equipment. You don't even need LiDAR for this. So I'll walk you through how we go from a drone imagery to a structure model to a tree map. So we fly the drone over our study site with a set of really dense transects and take a photo every couple seconds. So we end up with this large grid of photos across the study area, and they overlap quite a bit from one photo to the next intentionally, and that allows it such that a given tree will show up in multiple photos, but from slightly different angles. And the algorithm can use this parallax effect, or this fact that the top of the tree kind of seems to move by faster than the ground as the drone moves over, to infer the height of the tree. And actually does this for all the surfaces in the landscape and ends up producing what's called a digital surface model. And so this method is known as structure from motion photogrammetry, because by moving, you're able to quantify the structure. And so we can stitch all of the individual drone images together to make a continuous top-down orthomosaic that's geo-referenced in 3D space. And you could put this in a GIS software and pan around and see exactly where it is on the ground. But underlying all this is the 3D structure data from the structure from motion. So this is a canopy height model from that same stand. I can toggle so you can kind of see the correspondence. So it's similar to what you get from LiDAR, but actually higher resolution and obtained with low cost consumer grade equipment. So then we can apply an algorithm that takes this canopy height model and identifies the local maxima or treetops. And that's what gets us our individual tree map, which we can then apply in many situations where we'd use a traditional ground-based inventory or STEM map, but the drone map can be much more spatially extensive, more efficient to collect. But of course, there's shortcomings as well. Like we do miss a lot of the understory trees. So for any application that's focused on the understory, this is probably not the ideal method. And so although this process seems straightforward, there are a lot of decisions to make every step of the way. Like what altitude should you fly at, how much overlap between photos, how many, what settings to use for the photogrammetry algorithm, different parameters for how you detect individual trees from the canopy height model. And there's not much guidance on the impacts of those parameter choices on individual tree detection accuracy, especially for our for our study system. So part of our mission was to create this guidance. And recently there have been some really valuable studies that have helped shed light on the impact of some of these different options, which we used as a foundation for our work. But a big unknown is there might be interactions between these parameters, like the altitude you fly at might affect the optimal imagery processing resolution and et cetera. So we focused particularly on evaluating these interactions by combining the different parameter options in many different factorial combinations, which ultimately led to us having thousands. Well, okay, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll should say first, we initially did this assessment at the study site at Emerald Point in Emerald Bay State Park on the shore of Lake Tahoe, where our collaborator Jonah Weeks spent most of the summer making a really detailed ground-based forest inventory STEM map covering 4 hectares. Wanted to give a big thanks to Dan Shaw at California State Parks for facilitating the logistics here. It's not trivial to fly drones in state parks for good reason. And then here's a photo of where I piloted from. These were some of the best fieldwork days of my career. Yeah, hard to beat this. It helped make up for all those years of crawling through thorny shrubs. And it also shows the drone we used, a standard consumer drone. The drone and all of the accessories you need for this data collection, you could get for under $3,000. And so we tested variation in all these parameters from how we flew the drone, the photogrammetry processing, the tree detection algorithm. And by combining all these different options, we ended up with thousands of different drone-based tree maps. And we evaluated each of them against the field-based data set one at a time. And so this involved writing an algorithm for matching the drone detected trees to the field mapped trees based on their correspondence. And so that we would know if our drone detected trees were true positives or false positives. And so we did this evaluation for all of our maps resulting from all the different parameter options. And with the optimal parameters that we found, we were really pleased with the accuracy. So for example, here for overstory trees over 10 meters height, we found recall, which is the percentage of trees on the landscape that we correctly detected was 69%. And precision, the percentage of detected trees that were accurate detections was 90%. And then better accuracy if we're focused just on the larger trees. And this is on par with or exceeds the accuracies that we've seen published, which is a pretty big milestone because our study site is among the densest and most structurally complex stands we've seen evaluated, where it can be really hard to tell where one tree ends and another starts in this dense, multi-layered system. And then we also had really strong drone-based height measurement with an R-squared of 0.95. And then in some preliminary unpublished work, we find we get even higher accuracy in burned stands in general, which we'd expect because the fire clears out the understory and increases the separation between the trees, which really benefits this process. And through this study, we documented the optimal flight altitude, image overlap, camera pitch, photogrammetry parameters, treetop detection parameters. I won't bore you with the details of that now, but the results are all published in this open access paper. And I'm always happy to walk through our results with anyone and get folks set up doing this. And because our work involved hundreds of photogrammetry processing runs, we also wrote a software library to automate the runs in a reproducible way. And what it entails is it's pretty simple. You just prepare this configuration file that lists out all of the parameters and what value you want to use for your run. And then you put this config file in one folder and all your drone photos in another folder, and you just run one single line in the command line, and it runs the full processing workflow all the way to the end and saves the outputs in another folder. And so this config file remains as documentation of your processing parameters, so you could reproduce it. And so this is open source code. We put a lot of work into this, and would be thrilled for others to use it, and happy to walk anyone through it. And it's actually kind of been cool to hear people are coming across this and starting to use it, and it's really taken off, and so that's always really satisfying. So that ends this section of the drone based methods, and now we're going to talk about how we take the drone-derived data and those individual tree maps and apply them to these ecological questions. And part of why we haven't approached post-fire forest recovery with using individual surviving tree maps is we haven't had that sort of data available across broad post-fire areas. But LiDAR availability and other technology is rapidly changing that. So we're aiming to get a jump on it by using the drone data from smaller sections of fires and gain some useful ecological insight in the process. And so just as a reminder, our objective here is to understand how to account for differences in the proximity and abundance of surviving trees on post-fire recovery. And so we studied 6 burned sites in dry conifer forests across California. At each of the sites, we surveyed dozens to hundreds of field plots. Here's an example of a plot. This one's on the 2018 Delta fire, and including showing off our ultra fashionable headwear. And at each site, we surveyed a dense grid of plots with 30 to 50 meter spacing. And the goal was to capture variation due to seed source proximity, but minimize all other variation as much as possible. And that really differentiates this from most other post-fire regeneration studies, where researchers generally aim to distribute sites across an entire fire footprint and actually try to capture as much variation as possible. So this was a specifically tailored effort specifically for the seed dispersal question. And so this map shows where the plots we surveyed on the 2012 CHIPS fire, with the colored points are plots, and the lighter colors mean more higher seedling density. And fun fact, this site reburned in the Dixie fire just a few weeks after our drone pilot finished collecting imagery there. So that was we'd surveyed all these plots but didn't have the imagery yet, so just barely got out of that one. Yeah, that's the reality of forest ecology in California these days. But then we processed the drone imagery, as I explained in the previous section, to map the individual surviving trees. So now here's a point for each tree with the shading indicating the tree height. And I'll toggle back and forth here so you can see the correspondence here. And so then we did this at all of our other sites. Here's the Valley Fire site at Boggs Mountain Demonstration State Forest, and with the surviving trees detected. And I owe a huge thanks to CAL FIRE FRAP and especially to Dashi Moody and Dave Sapsis for helping with the field logistics here. And more importantly, for setting up this long-term post-fire management study, because most of Boggs was salvaged and sprayed and planted post-fire, but they reserved these plots as unmanaged for long-term research, and really valuable resource, and the sort of thing we need more of everywhere. And here's another site. This is the 2001 Crater Fire, and here with the trees detected. And for this one, a big thanks to Mark Meyer and Lexi Bernal for surveying these plots and contributing the data. And then here's our largest site, is the 2018 Delta Fire on the Shasta Trinity National Forest. And here again, with the trees detected. So this was our largest site. It was over 300 hectares, over 30,000 drone photos. We mapped over 8,000 trees and surveyed over 300 regen plots. So now that we have all of our sites, have the trees mapped and the plots surveyed, we have the data we need to start on the dispersal modeling. So I'll describe our model. So, but starting not with our model, but a more traditional dispersal model, like in most previous post-fire regeneration studies, it fits an intercept alpha and a slope beta of some predictor of seed availability. So that could be the distance to the nearest surviving tree, or smooth seed input, like I described with this Gaussian smooth basal area. We used a different approach, a more mechanistic approach. It's a nonlinear Bayesian model that explicitly fits a dispersal kernel in the model. And so what it does is it predicts the number of seeds in a plot as the sum of the contribution of all of the individual trees across the landscape. So how do you get the contribution of each tree? This is where the dispersal comes in. All the dispersal kernel is this little function that converts from distance to seed rain. So if the tree is really close, you get more seed rain than if it's really far. And so if you have a regen plot, like the schematic in the bottom right, and in a very simplified landscape where there's only 3 surviving trees, you would, one tree that's 12 meters away, you could look up based on its distance, its seed rain, another tree that's 25 meters away and 37 meters. And then based on what the dispersal kernel tells you, you get the seed input of each of these trees. You just sum that, and that is the seed input at that plot. And we don't have any coefficients to fit here. What we fit instead is the shape of this dispersal kernel. And so effectively, this whole exercise is asking what dispersal kernel shape is most realistic for the data we collected. And so the big difference between this and the traditional model is that you have, with the traditional model, you have to decide what the smooth is before you fit the statistical model. And you can try it with different smooths, but that happens outside of the statistical model. With this mechanistic approach, you ask the statistical model to tell you what's the best shape of this dispersal kernel. And then we can do it by taking advantage of having this individual tree map. For the more statistically inclined, here's the more formal specification of our model, where the seedling density at plot J is the sum across all of the trees on the landscape I, of the seed input of that tree, which is composed of 2 components. The first is the fecundity or reproductivity of that tree as a function of its size. And then the second is the value you get out of the dispersal kernel based on the distance away that tree is from the plot. And so it's an example of what a dispersal kernel looks like. This is just the formula for one option, the exponential power kernel. And all of the orange here are the parameters that we're fitting with the statistical model. So that's just A and K of the exponential power kernel, and then the beta of this fecundity term, and that's just fitting how much does the reproductivity of the tree increase with its size. And that's something that I didn't mention in the previous slide, but it's one additional detail that we're also modeling here, is how this tree size relates to its seed output. And so I owe a huge thanks to Philippe Marchand, a Canadian ecologist, for developing this whole modeling framework and publishing really clear code that's well documented for running this in R and Stan. He developed it for the Barro Colorado island in Panama, but it works really well in our system as well. And so once we do this exercise, and assuming everything goes according to plan, we get the holy grail we're after, which is the dispersal kernel fitted to the data at each site. And it looks trivial and simple, but it's actually a really important piece of information that allows us to ask, for any given tree, how many seedlings do we expect to find at any given distance from it? To get this sort of information usually requires a really fancy theoretical physics model for how the seeds are carried by the wind, or carefully isolating a single tree and setting up an array of seed traps, or same thing from a very straight forest edge. But we were able to get at it with our entire map of thousands of trees all at once. And so then we can look at what this looked like, this dispersal kernel across all of our sites. And some of our sites have cleaner fits than others, and less uncertainty. And what might explain some of that? Well, at some sites, the patterns were just more clear, like even visually on the Delta Fire, you can see, for example, the plots that are closer to the surviving trees have higher seedling density, pretty clear and consistent gradient, versus the Valley Fire, where our kernel fits weren't quite as clean. That you don't see so much of that pattern. So I can get into what the reasons for that might be, but that kind of, at least at a lower level, explains the differences in our competence of model fits. And we can then plot the performance of our models. And so this is a plot of model fit. It's the y-axis is the predicted seedling density at each plot, and the x-axis is observed seedling density. And so with our fitted kernel model, our new approach, we actually explain almost 50% of the variation in seedling density just with our knowing the spatial arrangement of the surviving trees. And if we compare that to the more traditional approaches of the Gaussian smooth or distance to nearest tree, we see that our new approach is an improvement. So this means this whole exercise was worth it in terms of improving our ability to predict post-fire recovery. And it's really, really rewarding to see that despite the fact that this is such a noisy, to expect this to be such a noisy ecological process with a lot influencing it, we still are able to explain 50% of that variation. And then now we can then use those fitted kernels to do what's really important for post-fire management, and make predictions of seedling densities across a landscape, not just for our specific plots. Now we can go beyond our plots. And we see that with our new method, which is the map in the top left, we do get substantially different predictions than with the Gaussian smooth or the distance to nearest seed source. In particular, compared to the Gaussian smooth, you can see like in these gaps between the trees, we predict more seedlings than we would with the Gaussian smooth. So that means our model is capturing more importance of a long distance dispersal component. Then, of course, both are completely different from the distance to the nearest seed source, which really simplifies things by, for example, saying like this little cluster of trees is just being right next to it is just as you'd expect, just as many seedlings as being right next to this whole patch of surviving forest. And we know that's not true. And so now we have a more mechanistic way of representing that. And so then how do we actually like operationalize this in terms of like a way to inform management? Possibly we could use it to update the PostScript tool, which actually has its own kernel built in that what I previously was referring to as the Gaussian smooth. It's really a specific kernel, a Gaussian kernel. And so now that we have this more mechanistically informed kernel, we could potentially incorporate it in a future version of PostScript. And alternatively, if you're working at a site where you have an individual tree map, like from LiDAR or some other data set, you could use the dispersal kernel to predict seedling densities directly from that map of surviving trees. So we're working on a simple web-based tool that would allow you to upload a tree map and then have it spit out a map of predicted seedling densities. But that this a probably better approach for the longer term would be to actually add that as a functionality to PostScript, so allow the user to supply their own data on surviving trees. And so that's another possibility for future development. So to wrap up this section, I'm also going to point out a few of the interesting ecological patterns that jump out from this data set. The first is that we often tend to over-predict seedling densities. So an example of that is here in this plot where we observe very few seedlings, but we predict a lot. And these points, in some cases we predict a lot, and those sorts of points are the ones that show up near lots of seed sources, but have very few seedlings. And I think what this is reflecting is the fact that our model it's just purely a dispersal model. It doesn't include site suitability. Like these sites might just have a really poor substrate. You can kind of maybe even see from the image, it looks like maybe there's just less vegetation, just less productivity there. So that's something that comes through, and another reason why integration with the model that does include site suitability is probably the way to go. We also see the opposite pattern where in areas that are far from seed sources, where we'd expect no regeneration or very little, we get pretty high numbers in some cases. And you also see this in this scatter plot, where when you're even out like 300 meters from the nearest tree, you can get hundreds, or in some cases even 1,000 seedlings per hectare. And so we have a few potential explanations for this. One is delayed mortality, where trees may survive for a few years post-fire and be reproductive and produce seeds that become seedlings and then die. And by the time we come in to survey the plot, they look dead. So we assume they weren't seed sources, but really they were. And an alternative to that is another explanation is that what we're calling aerial seed banking, where, or some people call it facultative serotiny, where the trees aren't serotinous, but they can behave that way if fire burns at a time when the trees have ripening cones in the canopy, but have not yet released the seed. And then the fire kills the trees, and then the seeds disperse post-fire and germinate. And so we have some pretty good evidence this is happening. Like we see these really strong correlations between pine seedling density and pine cones on the ground, implying that the seeds originated locally, even in areas where all the trees are dead. And in these areas, we tend to find these cones with these charring patterns where the cones are charred where the scale would be exposed when the cone is closed, but then and then the cone, so the cone must have burned while the cone was closed, but pretty close to fully developed in the canopy, and then the cone opened post-fire. And so we actually have a completely separate study focused on this phenomenon, especially on some of the 2020 fires and then the 2021 Dixie and Caldor fires, where we're finding a ton of evidence and just lots of seedlings very far from seed sources. So this aerial seed banking does seem to be happening under at least certain conditions, and so we're writing this up, about to submit a manuscript on this. So now wrapping up the ecology section, I want to jump back in and finish the talk by describing some of the areas where we're actively working right now in forest mapping, with some results coming soon. So a key component of mapping that I kind of sneakily glossed over is tree species ID. This is obviously super important because different species have different seed sizes and dispersal distances, different management priorities. So we need to tackle it. A traditional approach for using remote sensing for species ID uses multispectral data from some satellite sensors that have it. The spatial resolution is usually too low to see individual trees, but the high spectral resolution can enable us to differentiate different vegetation types based on their spectral signature. But we're not actually using this approach. The drone imagery enables a totally different approach because of the super high spatial resolution. So even without fancy multispectral sensors, we can see a lot more detail in terms of the texture and appearance of the image that allows us to identify what's there. And so we can use computer vision AI models to classify the contents of the images. The same sort of model that can look at pictures of dogs and classify them to breed could take a picture of a tree crown and classify it to species. So this is an orthomosaic, top down. That's not the ideal perspective to ID a tree from. So we can take advantage of the fact that we also have all the raw drone photos. And in the raw photos, because of the perspective of the camera, you do get a side view of some of the trees. And we also, at all of our sites, we also intentionally fly a second mission over the whole site with a lower altitude and an oblique camera angle so that we intentionally can get more of the side view for species ID. So these are two shots of the same group of trees where these trees match up. And so then we can crop out individual trees and use these as inputs to the computer vision species classification algorithm. And so we have a whole workflow for finding the tree location in 2D geographic space, finding which drone photos it occurs in, and then cropping it out of those photos. And because of the high overlap and the fact that each tree shows up in many different photos, we get dozens of views of each tree. And so this can really boost the performance of the species ID algorithm. So we've tested this so far with a set of 500 hand-labeled images cropped from drone images, where we trained a really simple computer vision model that really it's only like 15 lines of code. It's a really amazingly powerful, easy to use tool called Fast AI in Python that I highly recommend. And so we trained it on hand-labeled images and then predicted to a new set of 100 images. And at least at the genus level, we're getting really shockingly high accuracies of generally over 90% for species or genus classification. And so we have a lot more work to do to extract all the trees from all of our STEM maps and train the model a lot better, and expect this accuracy to grow. And so then the next step would be to apply this to our individual tree maps, and we'll get to assign species to these trees and build more realistic models where we have like a different dispersal kernel for each species. And then we're also evaluating the potential to use computer vision even earlier in our workflow to detect tree locations. And this task is relying heavily on Ben Weinstein's Deep Forest Python package, which is trained on data from NEON sites across the country. So another key next step for us is, beyond this, is also documenting the consistency and variation in tree detection accuracy across forest types and conditions. So to wrap up, I just want to address this question of how relevant really is all this individual tree-based mapping for post-fire planning. I have to acknowledge that at this point, data on individual surviving trees across large wildfires is limited. Drone flight footprints are also small. I just did a back of the envelope and calculated that to fly the entire mosquito fire by drone would take about 250 days with one pilot. So not feasible for large scale analysis. So the key current applications of drones involve collecting data from more focused areas in order to inform existing tools that do apply at a broader scale, like PostScript, and more generally as a complement to traditional field surveys. Many types of data that are traditionally collected from the ground, like overstory tree maps, can be collected by drone, but more efficiently and over more area. So in many cases, we can think of drones as complements to laborious field data collection. Some people have started using the term sky truthing comparably to what we would call ground truthing. And then looking down the road, there are multiple efforts underway that should soon result in public availability of individual tree maps at a statewide or broader scale, so that the individual tree-based models we're developing will eventually be applicable to much broader landscapes. And then finally, to wrap up, I'm excited that much of this recent and ongoing work that I described is coming together as a basis for the newly launched project funded by the National Science Foundation called the Open Forest Observatory. The OFO will host a large data set of drone-derived forest inventory data and associated imagery that anyone can access and contribute to, as well as a database of a bunch of traditional field-based forest inventory maps that we'll use for training and validating our methods, and anyone else could use for their own remote sensing methods, and along with a set of easy-to-use software tools for processing drone imagery into inventory data. And this will be all in a cloud-native, easily searchable and accessible format. So this is, and again, really geared around low-cost consumer drones with the ultimate goal of making drone-based forest mapping accessible even to people and groups with limited drone experience and limited budgets. So just want to thank all of my key collaborators on this work, and in addition to everyone I mentioned throughout the talk, our really dedicated crew members who spent a lot of hot days in burned forests. And then, of course, a huge thanks to CAL FIRE for funding this work with a Forest Health Research Grant through the CCI program, and then funding from NSF for the Open Forest Observatory. Yeah, thanks everyone for listening. It's great to get to share this work, and happy to take questions now or later. And my email is on the slide as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Derek. That was a really fascinating presentation, and we already have some questions lined up in the chat and a couple of hands raised, so we will get right into those. But first, I am going to stop the recording and